Welcome to another edition of Providence Threads, and today I am so excited to introduce our guest. You are going to be blessed by this conversation. The question that we're asking today is, what are we willing to do, not just as individuals, not as a church, but as the church, the Big C church, to reach the next generation? And we have a special guest today, and it's Mark Matlock. He is one of the authors of this book. Maybe we'll dive into this, maybe we won't. We'll see where we're going to go. But Mark, first of all, I want to say thank you for coming into Holland. You're not from here, but you've come in here for Movement.org West Michigan, our One Community Week, and you're going to be a speaker tomorrow morning to a bunch of pastors and leaders.
Yes.
So thank you for joining us for that.
Hey, it is my pleasure to be here. The Holland's beautiful. I just have to remind myself when I'm tempted to move here that it's not going to be warm like this forever.
Don't stay like this all the time. For those who might not have known the name Mark Matlock before, could you just give us a 30,000 flyover? Who's Mark? Where are you? Kids, family, ministry, that.
Yeah. So I grew up in Southern California, went to Biola University. When I finished Biola, I moved to Texas to work in youth ministry, doing large discipleship conferences with a guy named Dawson McAllister, who was a youth speaker. And I met my wife during that move in 1991, and she was a Texan, so that meant that there was a pretty good chance I was staying in Texas. And I ended up taking over that ministry as they were going through changes. They turned it over to me, and then I went on and eventually led Youth Specialties with Zondervan, just down the road in Grand Rapids. And I in 2016, felt that God was calling me after 25 years of doing those events. It was time to step away, and I did, and didn't know what I was going to do next. But I've been working with David Kinnaman since he graduated from Biola, and he's younger than me, when he was working for George Barna, and he had bought Barna Group, and he and I had become best friends during the process of doing lots of different research projects. And he said, "Hey, maybe it's time for us to write that book we've been talking about writing." And I'd helped them with some of the research and background work on a couple other projects. So that was Faith of the Exiles, where we were studying why young people were leaving the church and trying to understand. Everybody was reporting these huge numbers of people who had grown up in the church that were walking away. We were trying to figure out why. And so that was a book called You Lost Me that David wrote, and I had my fingers in it. But one of the things that's great about research projects is every project leads to another research project. Because there's something that doesn't go right, or you go, whoa, what is this? And I got to explore this. So what we found in this is we were looking at why people were leaving, but we found that there was this group of young people that were staying in church. Well, why are they staying? And what makes them who they are? And that was Faith for the Exiles.
Well, back in the youth specialty days.
Yeah.
I mean, that was years ago.
Yeah.
And I had more hair.
So youth specialties, you were probably born in like 1970-ish.
Yeah.
I was 69.
Right.
That's when it launched.
Yeah.
So youth specialties literally as old as you and I are.
But as a part of those conferences, in a fun story that I remember, going to the big gatherings for youth pastors, directors, leaders, they would bring out this carpet for one of the leaders, Mike Yaconelli, and it became, "Come dance on this carpet. Come spill your coffee. Come do whatever you need. Make a mess," because youth ministers always got the blame for something broken in church.
Yep.
But the whole premise of that was, how willing are we to go as a church to reach the next generation? And that's what I see in just the questions and the research in this. But all right, we have some kids that are growing up, young adults who are resilient in their faith, but we have a whole host that we're missing something.
Yeah.
So there's a quote in here that says, in the book, research will show about 64%, 65% of those who were once attending a church no longer do.
Yeah.
A quote in the book says that one of the main reasons is insufficient discipleship. Can you unpack that a little bit? And could you also give maybe another 2 or 3 key things of why this exodus that's happening?
So when the book that preceded Faith for Exiles was called You Lost Me, and we started doing some segmentation on young people because everybody was reporting that young people were leaving the church, but we weren't necessarily understanding why. Yeah. And so everybody was making conjectures as to why they were leaving. So we wanted to know more. So in that, Dave and I started using this language, prodigal, nomad, exile, which in this book, Faith for Exiles, we actually consider all of them exiles. And we have prodigals, nomads, habituals, and resilient disciples. Now, I'll explain what those mean.
So define those, yes.
Yeah. So the prodigal, because some people go, well, everybody leaves church when they, graduate high school and they're going through college and, they're just uprooted and that's just a normal thing. But that's not what was happening, right? So the prodigals are those that actually said, I consider myself to be a Christian and I no longer identify as a Christian. And we played with the idea of calling them ex-Christians, but we felt prodigal was more hopeful.
Yeah.
That maybe they were just lost and were going to find their way back. And that's our prayer for the prodigals. And then there were the nomads. The nomads are those who have said, I'm taking my faith on the road. The church isn't the place for me, but I still love Jesus. I still identify as a Christian. Now, what's interesting in our research is that nomads and prodigals actually behave very similarly.
Yeah.
It's really just how they identify. So a nomad is really just one step away from becoming a prodigal, unless, something happens. Then we have the habituals. Now, habituals are going to church frequently, but when we ask them just basic questions about the faith,
they're pretty clueless.
And they don't consider Christianity to be central factor in their life. So it's not affecting their decisions, shaping their future, or the way they think about how they live every day. Now, what's concerning is that the majority of young people in our churches are habituals. So only about 10% are what we call resilient disciples. And those resilient disciples are those that actually have a faith that could replicate itself in the life of another person, that is thinking about how am I living on earth?
Whole gospel goal,
what we're trying to do, right? Now, what was interesting is with habituals is we dug in deeper with them. We found that there were some that had their hand on the door. They were just waiting for an excuse to open it and become a nomad or a prodigal.
Yep.
Then there were some that were probably just resilient disciples in the making. Like they hadn't been in it long enough to be able to really go the distance, or maybe their church just wasn't doing a very good job of providing discipleship resources. And I think what's important to underline all of this is that when we at Barna ask pastors, how give your church a grade on how you think you're doing on discipleship, the average comes back to about a C-.
That's higher than I expected.
And so, that's probably because they don't want to go as low as they probably feel. But it is telling that pastors are self-scoring their churches, saying we're not doing a very good job at discipleship. Now, this research for Faith for the Exiles was done right before the pandemic, and so what was interesting is we did follow-up research mid-pandemic and post-pandemic. And what we found is that sure enough, those resilient discipleship numbers held, but the habituals actually decreased and moved over into the nomad and the prodigal categories. So the pandemic provided this event that allowed for this kind of like exodus or this break. Now, we also were looking at the conditions of the cultural change that was happening in the world, and this idea that we are going through an kind of a cultural crisis that was brought on by the internet, where we were all of a sudden being confronted with people's stories that were not like us. So the country has always been a diverse country, but we haven't always had to deal with diversity in the way that we are having to in the era of the internet, where all of a sudden every voice had a platform and a microphone. And we were hearing from people that were in communities that were different than ours. And this caused a disequilibrium to happen. And so we compared the difference between like living in Jerusalem versus living in Babylon.
Yep.
And what the church was going through was an identity crisis, because it was realizing we aren't living in Jerusalem anymore, where this nation is founded on Christian principles. And I feel this all, we realize we've been insulated a little bit and not really involved in the cultural conversation that was going on. And now all of a sudden we're having to deal with it. And we were behind.
Way behind.
Way behind. And so, we call that digital Babylon. And we have young people that are kind of caught up in that crisis. Now, as I'm traveling around the world into other countries, what's interesting is Gen Z, which is the generation right now of high schoolers and college students who have graduated in the last 5 years, they are kind of like consistent around the country. We found in our global research of 25 countries that Gen Z has more in common with each other across the globe than they do the generation above them. Now, that doesn't mean they're a homogenous generation. That's not what that's saying. They have a lot of diversity in their views and their perspectives, but they share a commonality.
Because they're digital natives. That's what they grew up with.
Yes, that's uncommon when you compare them to the generations above them. So what's interesting is the U.S. is maybe on the forefront of some things as the church, but imagine dealing with issues of gender identity and things like that, and it's not 2025, it's 1975. And that's what the cultural experience is for the church in several other countries, because the country is more conservative, but Gen Z is the same. So they're dealing with a real tidal wave of issues, and in the U.S., the average age of an American is about 43 years old, whereas you look at like most of the nations across Africa, the average age is 19. So when we talk about what we're dealing with in the United States, the church in other countries is dealing with this next
exponential.
It's very radical, and they have power as a generation because there's so many of them, and they're hyper connected. So it's a real interesting moment in terms of what are we doing to help this generation live into who God called them to be.
Talk to me a little bit about the habituals.
Yes.
What are the deep spiritual questions that they're asking that is either keeping them a habitual or stepping out the door, or maybe creating some curiosity to step that the church can be more aware of? Do you have some of that data?
So what's really interesting is when we looked at the difference between habituals and resilient disciples. Now you have to remember, they're going to church about the same frequency, right? So it's not like one's going to church more. Most resilients go to church on Sundays regularly and attend something else.
Yep.
So there's another layer of involvement than the habituals. But what we found is that there were 5 qualities that made the resilience stand out from the habituals, the nomads, and the prodigals. The first was an experience of Jesus. Somehow they were able to get through all the religious clutter that we've made in our churches, and they were able to truly experience joy and a relationship with Jesus. They described Jesus and their relationship with Jesus in relational terms. So they're praying, they're reading their Bible, they feel like Jesus is guiding them in their life and the Holy Spirit's guiding them in their life. So they use relational language. The habituals talk more about Christianity as a religion. Church is what I do as a practice. So those were different things. The second thing was meaningful relationships. Resilient disciples said that they found there were people in the church that they admired and wanted to be like and be around.
So intergenerational ministry.
Intergenerational relationships, yeah. Now, what's interesting is we thought, well, maybe that's why young people are habituals, is because they have relationships at church. They're coming for their friends, whatever. They actually are about 20 percentage points lower in terms of relational connectivity at church than the resilient disciples. So that is also a factor of why they're there. So, because that's our big question is, why are they even coming, right? The third thing was cultural discernment. So using the Bible to navigate a secular culture. And then the fourth was vocational discipleship, seeing what they do in their work as a extension of how they make Jesus known. And then the fifth was living on countercultural mission. This idea that I know that I'm living differently than the rest of the world because I'm a follower of Christ. So those are the 5 qualities that really marked a resilient disciple that stood out among them. And so those are some of the areas that we think we can shore up. One is if you have somebody who's been growing up going to church, have they really met Jesus?
Yeah.
And it was interesting because I presented this when it was first done, before it was even a book yet. Presented the research to a group of pastors in Dallas, and I went to the bathroom, and there were 2 pastors in a stall talking to each other about the presentation.
So I haven't met Jesus yet?
So
Hopefully not.
Yeah. Well, I was just being really quiet because I'm like, they're talking about me and what I just said. And one of them said, yeah, those 5 things, I don't know what that vocational discipleship thing is, but we do the rest of that. And I'm like, did you not just see that the research shows
right?
Maybe you're not, And so just we have to be really honest as church leaders and say, there are people in our church that are coming that they may not be experiencing Jesus, they might not yet have met Jesus. The beautiful thing though is these habituals are coming to church.
So we have the opportunity to witness and
right.
share.
This is low hanging fruit. This is really easy to bring them in. And so those conversations have to happen. One of the things that I realized too, as we were doing this research, and I was at the time a small group leader in my own church in Texas, and I was realizing that the interior world of teenagers is becoming very developed because of the internet.
Yep.
And so we call this, Faith for Exiles, ways a new generation is following Jesus in digital Babylon. So we got the Babylon shift, we got the digital piece. And for a lot of people, they're saying, well, the church hasn't been disrupted by the internet because you can't really get church on the internet. You have to be with people, fellowship, worship together, serve together. But what was happening was a lot of young people were exploring spirituality using Google. And what tipped me off to this is I went into the doctor's office one day, and my doctor said, what do you think you have? That's a great question.
That is. And you can say, well, I searched Google and I put in my symptoms and let me tell you. And
right. And I looked at him and I said, well, that's why I'm here, is for you to tell me. And he goes, I know you've already Googled everything and you couldn't figure it out. And so I want to know what you learned. And I said, that was a really great question. What led you to ask that question? And he said, I've realized that everybody goes to the internet before they come to me. I learned things from them. I also know things that maybe misconceptions that they have, home remedies that might actually be causing other problems because they're not realizing that it might be natural, but it has an impact on your system.
Yep.
Anyway, he's like, I can only keep up with so much change that's happening in the medical field. He goes, sometimes I learn things from my clients. But for my patients. So I started thinking about that with young people because I realized in conversations with one young man in particular, he was arguing with me about whether or not God really existed. And he's a senior in high school. And I've been in my church long enough that I remember when his mom and dad said they were pregnant. I remember him coming in his stroller to the first church service and getting checked into the nursery. And I also know this kid isn't smart enough to be talking to me like he is.
Right.
So where has he gotten this from? Right. And sure enough, he said a couple phrases over again. I Googled those and up pops this website, How to Debate a Theist. And I realized, but normally when a young person was struggling with their faith, they would come to me.
They'd come to the youth pastor. Yeah.
And they'd talk about it.
Yeah.
They'd say, hey, I'm having these doubts or whatever. But now they've already gone on a journey before they're ever coming to me. And now I'm having to deconstruct what's been constructed in them because they've already built this worldview, and now I'm starting behind. And so we have to have conversations with the young people in our church.
What are you reading? Where are you at? Where are you coming up with this?
Yeah. What do you think about, what do you think about God? What do you think about all this? What do you love about church? What's boring you to death? And be really open to making it a safe place for them to talk about these things, because we don't know otherwise. And I would have never guessed that this young man was dealing with what he was dealing with. because I'm watching him come to church.
Yeah.
He's worshiping and singing the songs. He went on a mission trip. You know what I mean?
Doing all the right things.
All the outward external markers tell me he's okay. But when I got into his interior world, found out, no, there's another dialogue going on between him.
I want to come back to asking some questions about the digital piece, but before we miss it, in the chapter about having an authentic relationship with Jesus, and that's what resilient disciples have. Habituals aren't walking that. You use a phrase that we use this kind of thing in church that we just brand Jesus. Can you talk a little bit about what churches may be doing, or that we can become aware that we miss it? I planted a church years ago, and I remember we had all these misfits. These people shouldn't be in the room together, right? And then we started connecting them, and this small group, and they're full of energy and life, and let's eat and all that. But slowly, that small group just started to it became so toxic and so terrible. And what I realized is I connected these people who never knew community before. I connected them to community, but I didn't get them connected to Jesus.
Wow. That's quite a thing for you to say that.
Well, it's painful to hear.
Yeah, I know. Because there was a lot of time building that community, but then to miss that piece. But
right.
Wow.
But that's branding Jesus, right? We're connecting them to this religious thing or these concepts, but we're missing the person of Jesus. Say more.
Well, I go back. I grew up in church. I literally don't remember a time I didn't go to church, right? I think if you had told me I was born on a pew, I'd believe it. Literally, what's going on over there? Oh, it's a boy, So I don't remember. And for me, I've always struggled. Like I have a little saying, it's hard to silence your inner Pharisee. And the inner Pharisee misses Jesus all the time. Yep. And the more that we pursue Jesus, sometimes we miss him, because when you really look at these Pharisees, they wanted to be holy. They wanted to do what was right. There was a motivation there that was really close to God's heart, but also 1,000 miles away from it. And I think we always have to just really be on guard with that, as leaders and as Christians. Is Jesus the center? Is he what this is all about? And there have been many times I've been in churches and I just listened to that whole sermon and Jesus was never mentioned. Even I remember a time in my life so the organization I started was called Wisdom Works. And I was doing this whole discipleship model based on Proverbs, because Luke 2:52, Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God and men. So how do we help students grow in wisdom? I was focusing so much on the wisdom that somebody raised their hand in a youth specialty seminar and said, "Where's Jesus in all of this?" And I went, oh, yeah. He's implied, because he is the Word made flesh, and this is all scripture based, that I missed Jesus in structuring some of this, and it was that kind of a moment like you probably had as you're looking at and it takes somebody, the little kid in the crowd to go, "He's got no clothes," to kind of make you go, "Oh, wait." And so I think we always have to be mindful of that. And making sure that we're focusing on Christ. And unfortunately, because we don't have eyewitnesses to Jesus still with us today, it's hard for us to capture, I think, the emotional intelligence of Jesus. I just finished The Chosen season 4. And I think that's one of the things that they've done a really good job with, even though they've taken a lot of liberties with the story and everything, that they've given Jesus an emotional intelligence that a lot of Jesus movies haven't had.
He's just so stoic and
yes, yeah. He has this weird Jesus stare, and he walks in the room. "It is not my time yet. My time has not come." And he's all like in a fog or something like that, or just always above us. And this is a Jesus that's really present and emotional. And it's helped me realize, I started reading some books on relational theology, because I realized grace is not a theological concept. grace is a relational word.
Yeah.
You cannot experience and understand grace outside of a relationship. And so I've been trying to just really focus on that and really questioning, even as I'm reading scripture, when I'm reading the red letters, what's the voice in my head? Is it,
how's he walking into the room? What's the look in his face?
Right. Because, you can look in here, he goes, you'll go away and sin no more. And we love that passage because it's like, well, he didn't give her a pass. He still, in the end, he told her, don't do it. Don't mess up again. But at the same time, I think we just forget how much he, just with his presence, affected people. And they felt safe. They felt loved. And it wasn't just his words, but it was his being.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that we miss in the text sometimes, that if we don't spend some time to really embody it, and therefore we teach theology and not a relational way of.
Yeah, here's just some facts, here's some information. No, this is a person that you need to spend time with.
Yeah. And, and it's a weird thing because I resisted watching The Chosen for a long time. And when I watch that, I go, oh my gosh, it's changing the way I'm reading Jesus in the text in the Bible. Mm-hmm. I'm hearing a different quality in him, I worked with Pete Scazzaro on emotionally healthy discipleship. We did some pilot projects with teenagers for a few years to see how they dealt with the material. And it was really coming out of like churches were saying, what do we do as a result of this? And emotionally healthy spirituality is a really key part. And Pete's journey and what I've seen emotionally healthy do in the lives of so many churches and leaders is go, whoa, I'm doing all the right things, but I'm not being healthy, and so that's been a really key insight, I think, in terms of that brand of Jesus.
Being overdoing, being overknowing.
Yes. And just learning how to practice the presence of Christ in our life and truly imitating him passionately. Yeah.
I want to jump into the digital piece, and I read on the chapter here. I read it and I had to set it down and just think for a while. Again, people our age, in our 50s, 30 and above, would have no concept of this. But you were talking about, just as you were sharing earlier, I have a question. I'm not going to a doctor. I'm not going to a parent. I'm not going to a pastor or a youth pastor. I'm just going to Google it. And just, what's it say here? And I'll explore wherever. Mm-hmm. But in that chapter, you also talked about living in digital Babylon as exiles. And it's not just us young people. We're living in it too.
We're living in it too, yes.
But the latest data that came out was saying that when it comes to pornography, Gen Z has a positive, or worst case scenario, a neutral view to it. Not negative, not like a verse or oh my.
Yeah, one study we did, people actually ranked not recycling as being worse than viewing pornography.
So I just wanted to name that for those who are listening, especially those who aren't living in Gen Z, because Gen Z would say, yeah, of course, that's a no-brainer.
Yeah.
When I read that, I'm like, oh my, what is that doing to a generation that's growing up? And how do we reach with truth and grace and the wisdom of Christ?
Yeah, once again, we get to that, one of those qualities of a resilient disciple is cultural discernment.
Yeah.
Really being able to navigate the culture with the word of God. And one of the things that, I'm seeing right now, because we're really seeing a resurgence of Gen Z, like returning to spiritual things. Mm-hmm. They don't necessarily know the Bible. They don't necessarily, and even if they're not going into church, they're pursuing spirituality. They're using tarot cards or their astrology, different things like that. And so they are realizing that there is more out there. And a lot of them are coming back to the church, or coming to the church for the very first time without a clue what it's about. Presently, I'm leading the Urbana Missions Conference for InterVarsity. It will be happening at the end of this year. And as I'm working with all these college campuses, we're hearing reports of just students coming, going, I don't know anything about the Bible. Can I be a part of this Bible study?
Awesome.
I was just talking to a kid in his late 20s, a young man in his late 20s who runs a coffee shop in St. Louis area, and they do the public reading of scripture where they play just an audio Bible portion for an hour, and they've got all these people just coming to listen.
Just come sip coffee and listen.
Yeah, they don't talk about it. They just listen to the Bible and fellowship together and have coffee together. And I think there's something about that that's really interesting. This generation, we kind of did this whole excellence in the church thing of, hey, if I'm going to do it for the Lord, let's do it the best we can. And we got so excellent that we all of a sudden were no longer in the moment.
Yeah.
Because being in the moment, it's hard to do that without a lot of preparation. Your preparation gets put to the side. And this generation is looking for that rawness. Like, we were literally like leading worship with this group of Gen Z leaders, and just the worship leader who was from that generation just said, does anybody have a chorus that we need to be singing right now? And I'm like, he's just like opening it up. And he wasn't saying like, what song do you want to sing next? He was like, do you have a word that we need to start singing?
Interesting.
And somebody just like said a sentence, and then they just started singing it. It wasn't a song. And
Until now.
And so there's this in the moment thing that feels that's I always, we were talking about the word authentic, that's what it is. That word gets overused, I think, almost, but it's a real rawness, and it defies the polish. For Urbana, we actually had all of the agencies that are going to be exhibiting at Urbana about their mission agencies and their opportunities give us their recruitment materials. We put together a portfolio, and we did focus groups with students likely to come to get their feedback on the messaging, the different style of things and whatnot. This generation, they are sophisticated marketing. They have been marketed to more than any other generation since they were like infants, right? It goes deep into their subconscious mind. They could spot the AI generated pictures without any hesitation. They knew when a photograph was staged, if it was stock photography versus original photography. They have a disdain for anything that is staged or choreographed. And so that doesn't mean that we don't plan or prepare by any means, but it means that we also realize that when we come together, that is a unique once-in-a-lifetime thing.
Be present in the moment.
Be present in the moment. And, it's interesting, but this book came out before the pandemic. And literally, if you could watch the sales of the book, taking off, pandemic hits.
Crash.
Unless you were using it for toilet paper, you were not buying this book, right? And that was true of all books for a period of time. But when you have all of a sudden sales cycles being pushed back and then being, put in, I'm like, we've lost all of our energy around this book. Except that this book had a prophetic message in it around discipling the next generation. And what we realized in the pandemic is people aren't very formed in their discipleship. So this book all of a sudden started taking off, and people started reading it. And one of the things that I asked at the beginning of the pandemic, when we had the lockdowns on the first Sunday, I said, what did you not get at church today that you normally get? People had a hard time answering.
Interesting.
A lot of them answered with a question mark at the end, like fellowship, hugs, and you could hear them just like, raising their voice at the end when they would write. They were guessing. They didn't know, or they thought that I knew the answer and they were supposed to guess what it was. But they really had a hard time nailing it. My reason for asking was, whatever they said, that's what we as a church need to really camp on, because that's the thing we can't do anywhere else. But people were having a hard time defining that. And pastors really struggled with making their messages more interactive as I was coaching several of them on how do we create more experiential Zoom church things. And they're like, well, I just need to teach the word and get this message out. And I'm like, they can now click around to any teacher they want on Sunday.
They're going to be better than you.
Yeah. And from nine, like, they can hit whoever the 1% top is, that's who they can all go there in a click. So all of us were challenged, and I was trying to figure out how do we create a communal experience, and create messages that are more interactive. It was really hard because pastors really loved the sermon central piece. And what I think happened is we were coming out of the pandemic because we didn't say what's missing is we raced back to the sermon and worship.
Everything is normal.
And a lot of people were like, you know what I found? Taking church online is pretty efficient, right?
I can be in my jammies, have my coffee.
Yeah. But I think what doesn't happen online is the spontaneous connection. It's the person you sat next to, had lunch with afterwards, the story that was shared in the moment. And so there is something in that where the Holy Spirit is networking us and leading us and directing us. And I think this generation is looking for that in their experience with Jesus.
The real and the raw.
The real and the raw. And it's hard because it goes against so much of the fabric of what we've structured.
You got to be vulnerable. You got to be uncomfortable if you're going to live in that space.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we don't like that.
Yeah. And there are people that will say, I didn't come here to interact. You know what I mean? Like, like turn to your neighbor and answer this question. People are like, I'm out, right? All the introverts, And so, we really have a challenge ahead of us, but I think it's worth it for this generation. I think this generation, one of the interesting things is millennials, like for them, it was kind of like, I deserve a seat at the table. Like, let me in. Generation Z is actually a generation of best practices. They actually admire people who've already accomplished something and are like, I don't need to recreate it. Tell me what you know and let me steal your pain and your wisdom and move forward, right? So it's a really interesting quality about Gen Z. And so I think Gen Z has a real opportunity to help us advance the church.
Cut through the noise and what's best practices.
And I think what we have to look at the younger generations too is like there's a huge generational divide, particularly between the boomers and other people. In our research on flourishing and things like that, and even during the pandemic, we did research generational around how are you handling the pandemic. Boomers were just in a whole different place.
Yep.
They were either lying through their teeth in the assessments, or they truly were having a different experience because of where they were at in life.
Yep.
And they were established, they had wealth, they, whatever the case was, they were having a different experience than everyone else. And I think that's really important for us to realize is that generations are having different experiences. And when I started watching my kids on the internet, I realized we're both using the same tools,
but very different.
Very different. Our imagination is different around it. And I was like using the internet to maintain existing relationships. My daughter was using it to find new ones. And I'm like, whoa, that's really different.
Yep.
And so we have to figure out how to give emerging generations and millennials too. I don't want to totally, poo-poo them. They're great and they're helping us in a lot of ways too. But they have a different attitude, and we need to be careful that we don't put some of those same issues on the Gen Z, and we realize there's nuance there.
Yep.
But we also need to realize that we do need to give these younger generations a seat at the table of imagination. It's not about just empowering them, because we're not just saying, hey, you run with it. That's not giving them wisdom, right? A lot of Gen Z tells me they're terrified of being handed keys, but they do have something that we could use under our care. And they also want safety to fail.
Yep.
They want to know that they can try something and get the experience without the consequences of everything falling apart. So I think we have a really neat moment.
So building off that, you're saying there's kind of a prophetic nature to this book. Last question for us, kind of on the more maybe pessimistic or negative side.
Mm-hmm.
this is about 6 years old. You're
Yep.
getting feedback.
Yep.
So the feedback that's coming, kind of what kind of has you kind of like, oh, and keeping you up at night? And answer that one, but then I'd love to close on the opposite end. What feedback are you getting that has you most hopeful? Maybe you just kind of answered that a little bit, but I'd love to hear the position on both of those ideas.
Well, so for David, this is the third book in a trilogy. It started with a book called Unchristian. And in Unchristian, he and Gabe Lyons, they identified 6 things that were pretty critical issues that the church needed to deal with in order to engage those outside of the church. And what has happened since that book came out is like the church doubled down on those 6. Right? Mm-hmm. They didn't take the moment and theologize them for the moment. So one of the hard things about doing research is it's objective to a certain extent, right? And so you're going, this is reality. And then people go, I don't care.
And do nothing.
I'm not gonna change. What I'm seeing with Faith for Exiles is that people are reading it and going, okay, like you're saying, what do we need to do? How do we be a church that responds to this moment? And seeing that kind of action, which is really heartwarming. Mm-hmm. And we need to realize it's not going to be something that's fixed quickly. So we have to set our expectations. Yeah. It's a long obedience in the same direction, right? And so we need to really think about that way and be prepared for it, but not give up or lose heart. This generation is too worth it. And the bottom line is the Holy Spirit is calling them to him. We're hearing stories of these people like saying, I had a dream that told me I should come to church or whatever. Like God is.
And that's what you hear like in Muslim land.
You're hearing, we're hearing it amongst young people in the U.S. that are outside of the church and not darken the door. God is calling this generation to him. I don't want to miss that.
Yeah.
And then once again, it's hard to silence the inner Pharisee. And so I'm always going like, oh, Mark, don't miss this moment, and even though I'm doing the research and looking at this knowledge, I still know my tendency is to miss it. Yeah. So I want to say that because this isn't me looking down on the Church of America going, oh, you guys are missing it. No. And we're all doing better or worse in different degrees and different ways. But I think that we need to see what the Lord is doing and say, okay, let's be a part of it.
Let's jump on board.
Let's be a part of it. Yeah.
So Faith for Exiles, I highly recommend this to pastors, youth leaders, youth pastors, youth directors, parents. You can pick this up. But Mark, if people are listening today and saying, I want to know more about what this guy's doing, how do we get a hold of you?
Yeah, it's a good question. Pretty much, we're releasing stuff on Barna.com all the time. And so if people are interested in data and the insights, we try not to get into the data and get more into the insight part of what you can do about it. But I do have another book that just came out called Faith for the Curious. And if you are feeling like, okay, I feel like I'm in that generation that I don't know how to engage a person outside the church. We are living in an age of spiritual openness.
Yep.
Like never before. But we in the church have some framing that's a little wrong about how we're doing that. And so Faith for the Curious was written as a conversation of my personal experiences of sharing my faith, but also doing it with data and some of the insights about this cultural moment that we're in. And that would also be a great resource for anybody that was looking to go, okay, how can I do this with the people I work with? How do I do this with the young people? Maybe even in my own home, how do I know how to have a conversation with them, and open up the door? We talk about spiritual discovery questions and how to use those to engage people outside the church. And so that's another resource that could be helpful to them. But faithforthecurious.com, faithfortheexiles.com, those are some websites you can go to get more information about those particular books. So.
Thank you for making time for this. You've had a busy schedule. You just came in today. You're going to be here for movement.org. So thank you for coming to our community and helping us live more fully into this. And again, we just want to invite you who are listening and to Providence Threads, help share this information. As you heard here, Generation Z is a generation that God is stirring and moving and so worth our investment in figuring out how do we pour into. So if this could be helpful to somebody that you're walking with, other youth pastors, please pass it along. Grace and peace. Have a great day.